The sun hung low over the horizon, spilling molten gold across the endless expanse of the ranch. Dust rose from the dry earth in small clouds, twisting lazily in the heat, and the distant lowing of cattle punctuated the heavy silence. The house itself, a sprawling wooden structure of weathered planks and creaking porches, seemed to frown beneath the relentless sun. From the veranda, the rancher stood tall, broad-shouldered, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the figure approaching along the winding dirt road. He had always been a man of precision, of measured words and deliberate actions, but today, anticipation fluttered in his chest like a bird struggling against its cage. She appeared in the distance, her figure framed by the late afternoon light, moving with a purposeful dignity that drew his gaze despite his efforts to remain indifferent. She was every bit the image he had conjured in his imagination, tall, slender, and unyielding in posture. Her dark hair flowed behind her like a river of ink, catching the sun in muted glimmers. Her eyes, sharp and wary, scanned the ranch with a mixture of suspicion and resolve, as if she could see every fault, every weakness hidden behind the stoic facade he presented to the world. When she reached the porch, the air between them thickened, taut with unspoken judgments. He did not move to greet her. He simply let the silence stretch, measuring her reactions, waiting for her to falter. She did not. Instead, she lifted her chin, holding herself with the quiet command of someone accustomed to being in control, even when control was a fiction. "Welcome to the ranch," he said finally, his voice low, smooth, and just edged with something she could not immediately place, perhaps curiosity, perhaps caution. He did not offer a hand. "Thank you," she replied, her tone clipped, polite but distant. Her eyes swept across the veranda, taking in the rough-hewn beams, the wide stretch of land beyond, and the brown dust swirling around the feet of the few workers lingering near the barn. She did not smile, not yet. He studied her for a long moment, nodding the set of her jaw, the way her shoulders bore the weight of restraint. She was defiant, even in submission, and that defiance intrigued him in ways he was unwilling to admit. Years of planning, of cultivating the precise angle of revenge against her family, had not prepared him for this. He had intended to humiliate her subtly, to make her life difficult in ways that would echo the wrongs of her father against his own. He had expected fear, resentment, perhaps silent obedience. What he had not expected was the sharp, almost imperceptible fire in her gaze that dared him to try. "I trust your journey was tolerable," he said, though the words were more observation than question. She did not answer immediately, and he sensed a deliberate withholding of information. She was already learning the art of patience, and he acknowledged with a grudging respect that this would not be an easy conquest. "I managed," she said at last, voice calm, carrying a hint of quiet defiance. Her lips pressed into a line, and she let the words hang between them, a challenge unspoken but undeniable. He exhaled slowly, masking the small pang that rose unexpectedly in his chest. The pang was not one of fear, nor of surprise, but a subtle recognition that this woman would not bend easily, that she might even, he loathed the thought, reshape his plans entirely. And yet, for the first time, he felt an edge of anticipation that was not born of strategy, but of something far more precarious, curiosity. The first days were a study in tension. He made his intentions clear in subtle ways: a cold bed placed apart from his own room, tasks designed to test her endurance, expectations measured to remind her of her position within his carefully constructed world. She accepted them without complaint, her grace and dignity rendering every slight, every insult, more poignant, more powerful. It was during the first quiet evening, as the sun sank behind the western ridges, and the sky bloomed with shades of crimson and amber, that he noticed her at the edge of the barn, fingers tracing the rough planks as if seeking solace in the texture of the wood. She had removed her gloves, revealing hands delicate and pale, yet calloused in the subtle ways that bespoke effort and diligence. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps tears. Instead, there was quiet concentration, a calmness that both unnerved and fascinated him. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. The sound of his boots against the wooden floor was deliberate, measured, and she turned her head only slightly, eyes flicking toward him with a mix of caution and curiosity. "You work hard," he said, the observation simple, factual, yet carrying an unintended note of admiration. She did not respond immediately, her hands continuing their task with meticulous care. "I have to," she replied at last, voice low, almost thoughtful. "No one else will do it for me." The words were more than practical. They carried a quiet resilience, a subtle assertion of self that did not seek approval, only acknowledgement. He nodded, though inwardly the acknowledgement was not enough. He had never encountered someone who faced him so calmly, who matched his determination with a quiet steel of her own. He realized then, with a jolt, that the plan he had so carefully laid, the plan to break her, to bend her life to his whim, was already faltering. There was a fire in her, a defiance that refused to yield, and in that fire he glimpsed something unfamiliar: admiration, curiosity, even anticipation. The first act of domestic imposition came 2 days later, when he handed her a skein of yarn and a pair of needles. "Knit a sweater," he said, voice flat, carrying the weight of command. "For the girl working with the cattle. You'll do it properly. When it's done, you may leave." She looked at him, eyes narrowing slightly, lips parting as if to argue, then closing again. The words themselves were a test, layered with expectation, laced with cruelty. To her they were an insult, a demand disguised as necessity. Yet she did not speak them aloud. She simply accepted the yarn, the needles, and the task. In the quiet hours of the evening, she settled near the hearth, the warm light dancing across her features as she worked. Each stitch was deliberate, precise, a small act of defiance wrapped in compliance. She did not look up, did not seek his approval, but he watched, unable to tear his gaze away. There was something hypnotic in the rhythm of her hands, the steady movement of her fingers against the soft wool, as if in every loop and purl she wove her autonomy back into existence. Days passed in this delicate balance. He maintained the role of the harsh husband, cold and exacting, yet his eyes betrayed him at times, lingering on the curve of her neck, the quiet determination in her hands, the way she carried herself even in the face of imposed tasks. She sensed it, though she chose to ignore it, continuing her work with quiet diligence, each stitch a small act of rebellion, each row a testament to her will. One evening he found her standing at the edge of the pasture, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The wind tugged at her hair, lifting it in a loose cascade that caught the fading light. She did not speak, but her presence filled the air with unspoken tension. He stepped closer, boots crunching against the dry earth, yet still she did not turn to him. "You will finish the sweater," he said, voice low, almost a whisper, carrying an edge of command softened by unspoken tension. "After that, leave. Go where you will, I will not stop you." Her hands paused mid-stitch, the needles balanced delicately, and for a moment time seemed to hold its breath. She did not react immediately, as if weighing the command against her own inclinations, against the pride she had carried across her shoulders for years. Then slowly, deliberately, she returned to her work. The act was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. She was acknowledging his command without surrendering her dignity, complying without conceding. He watched, a strange ache rising in his chest, one he had not expected. It was not anger nor frustration. It was something heavier, more complicated, something that made his chest tighten with a mixture of admiration and unease. The ranch, which had always been a place of authority and control, became a stage for subtle battles of will. The woman moved with a quiet grace, claiming space not through defiance but through the assertion of self. Each glance, each measured movement, carried significance. He found himself noticing the way she tilted her head when concentrating, the slight curve of her lips when lost in thought, the intensity of her gaze that seemed to weigh him as much as he weighed her. One afternoon, as the sun beat mercilessly against the roof of the barn, he found her mending a tear in one of the workers' coats. Her hands were nimble, steady, careful. She did not flinch when he approached, did not pause when he cleared his throat. She simply continued, her focus unwavering. "You are meticulous," he observed, the words almost escaping before he could stop them. "Too meticulous for your own good." She glanced up, meeting his eyes with that same unwavering calm. "Perhaps," she said, voice soft but carrying weight, "but I would rather be meticulous than careless. It is easier to live with diligence than with regret." The word struck him harder than he expected. There was a wisdom there, a strength forged in hardship, that both humbled and unnerved him. He had expected resistance, perhaps, but not insight, defiance, perhaps, but not intelligence. And yet here it was, plain and unyielding. Night fell and the ranch was bathed in the cool, quiet glow of the moon. Crickets whispered in the fields, and the distant lowing of cattle carried across the still air. She sat by the hearth, knitting, each stitch a testament to patience, resilience, and defiance. He lingered nearby, ostensibly occupied with his own tasks, yet he could not help but watch, drawn by a force he did not yet understand, a curiosity he could not name. Finally, she set the completed sweater aside, her hands folding it carefully. She rose, her movements deliberate, dignified, and he felt an unfamiliar pang of fear, a recognition that once she left, the space she occupied, both physical and emotional, would be gone. "I am done," she said, voice calm but firm. As promised, she glanced at him, eyes steady, unyielding. "I will leave now." He stood frozen for a heartbeat, the wind tugging at the edges of his coat, dust swirling around his boots. Something within him resisted, a raw, unreasoned desire to stop her, to keep her within the walls of this ranch that had grown strangely hollow without her presence. Yet his pride, his carefully cultivated stoicism, demanded restraint. "Just knit the sweater, after that, leave," he said finally, voice low, carrying both command and a flicker of something else he did not yet acknowledge. She nodded once, folding the sweater with careful hands, and turned toward the door. And in that moment, as she walked away with the quiet dignity that had both infuriated and fascinated him, he felt the first stirrings of something dangerous, something powerful, an awareness that he would not, allow her to leave entirely. He took a step forward, then stopped, the soft scrape of his boot against the floor echoing in the empty space between them. She had completed the task, fulfilled her obligation, and yet he could not move past the hollowness settling into his chest. The horizon beyond the ranch stretched endlessly, golden and unforgiving, and somewhere in that vast openness lay the realization that the battle he had begun was far from over. And as the wind tugged at the edges of the porch, lifting her hair and carrying it across the sun-drenched boards, he knew, without fully understanding why, that the story had only just begun. The dawn broke pale over the ranch, filtering through the wooden slats of the veranda in thin beams that fell across the dusty floor. He was already awake, boots heavy on the boards, surveying the expanse of land that stretched beyond the fences like an untamed sea of brown and gold. The early light caught in the ridges of the hills, painting the world in subtle hues of warmth, yet the chill in his chest remained. He had expected her to leave after the sweater, as she had promised, and yet the empty spaces she might have filled gnawed at him more than he would ever admit. She emerged from the guest room shortly thereafter, the soft creak of the floorboards announcing her presence. Her hair, dark and glossy, was pulled back loosely, stray strands framing her face as she moved with an economy of motion that was both purposeful and graceful. She carried herself as someone who belonged to no one, yet everything about her presence distance, asserting a quiet ownership over the air around her. He watched, unblinking, as she moved toward the barn, and he felt that same peculiar tug, the ache of watching something he could not yet name slip through his fingers. Her task this morning was mundane yet intimate, mending the leather reins and worn saddles that bore the weight of cattle and men alike. She knelt beside the tack bench, hands deft, fingers brushing against the cracked and weathered leather as if coaxing it back to life. He approached, pretending to inspect the stock, yet his attention remained tethered to her. There was a rhythm to her movements, a steady grace that belied the hours of labor she had endured, and with each careful stitch and knot, he felt the walls he had built around his own heart tremble. "You work well with your hands," he said quietly, not demanding her attention, merely observing. She did not look up, but the faint lift of one brow suggested she had heard him. "I have learned to adapt," she replied, voice even controlled, carrying no note of gratitude. "It keeps trouble at bay." There was a subtle weight in her words that struck him, an acknowledgement that life had taught her discipline not out of choice but necessity. Her resilience was a quiet force, and though he had intended to break her, he now found himself measured against it, feeling an unfamiliar and disconcerting admiration. The day was long, sun climbing high in the sky, and the work unrelenting. Yet it was in the small moments, the interludes of shared silence, that the subtle shift began. They walked the fields together, tending the cattle, repairing fences, the air thick with dust and the scent of dry earth. She moved alongside him, matching his pace without yielding, and for the first time he felt the sting of vulnerability. He realized that the plans he had carried with such precision, plans to humiliate, to punish, were becoming irrelevant in the presence of her quiet strength. It was during the midday break, under the sparse shade of an old oak near the northern fence, that a storm of realization began to take shape. He watched her sip water from a tin cup, the sunlight catching the curve of her jaw, the delicate arch of her neck. She did not notice him studying her, yet the moment settled in him like a stone, heavy and irrevocable. There was a grace here that demanded acknowledgement, a presence that unsettled him more than any confrontation or battle ever had. "You must be tired," he said eventually, his voice low, as if the words themselves carried weight he had not intended. She shook her head, not looking at him. "I am accustomed to hard work," she replied. "It is better than sitting idle." Her words were not defiance, not exactly, they were simply truth, and it struck him how differently she bore the weight of life compared to himself. He had always believed strength meant control, command, dominance, yet she bore hers quietly, internally, with a grace that humbled him. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in muted shades of orange and lavender, she ventured near the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the ranch. He followed, unwilling to acknowledge the curiosity and the fear that propelled him forward. She knelt beside the water, fingers tracing the gentle current, her reflection mirrored in the rippling surface. The wind stirred her hair, and the golden light framed her in a way that made him forget the meticulous plans of vengeance that had brought her here. "You watch too closely," she said suddenly, eyes lifting to meet his. There was no accusation in her tone, only observation. Her gaze pierced him with its steady clarity, and for a moment he was caught, naked in vulnerability before her. I notice things, he said, shrugging, attempting to mask the sudden thrum in his chest. It is my nature. She considered him a moment, expression unreadable. Then perhaps you notice what you wish to see, not what is true. The words lingered in the air, heavy and deliberate. He did not respond because she was right. His perception of her was filtered through his own intentions, his own expectations, and yet every encounter revealed cracks in that lens. He could no longer ignore the subtle kindnesses, the intelligence, the strength that defined her. The next days brought trials not of labor, but of circumstance. A stray calf had wandered into the thickets, spooked and trapped, its cries echoing across the dry land. She was the first to respond, moving with measured urgency, coaxing the animal with gentle words and firm hands. He followed, aiding when necessary, yet it was her presence that calmed the creature, her voice soft and insistent. The sight of her commanding such respect, without force, without threat, stirred something raw in him, a recognition of power far beyond his own, and a fear he could not admit. He had come to the ranch with a plan, to use marriage as leverage, to bend her life into submission, to exact a slow, deliberate revenge upon her family. Yet watching her, seeing the quiet authority she carried, he realized that the plan was failing. Not because she was weak, but because she was strong in ways he could not anticipate, strong in ways that demanded his respect, and unwilling as he was to confess it, his admiration. The tension between them evolved, shifting from antagonism to something subtler, more dangerous. Small interactions, a shared glance, a momentary touch when passing tools, the occasional soft laugh that escaped her despite herself, carried an electricity he could not name. Each encounter chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses, and he began to recognize a truth he had been too stubborn to see, that his heart, so long shielded, was vulnerable to her presence. One late afternoon, he found her tending the garden near the east wing of the house, pulling weeds with meticulous care. The sunlight caught her profile, highlighting the delicate line of her cheek and the set of her shoulders, and he felt a pang he could not define. He wanted to speak, to comment on her diligence, yet the words tangled in his throat. Instead, he lingered, silent, watching as she worked with a grace that seemed both effortless and deliberate. "You do not need to overexert yourself," he said at last, voice low, almost hesitant. She paused, lifting her gaze to meet his, and in that moment the world seemed suspended. "I am used to effort," she replied softly. "It is how I survive." There was no complaint in her voice, no plea for acknowledgement. It was simply truth, and it struck him with the force of a revelation. She had endured hardship and emerged not diminished, but stronger, unbroken, unyielding. And in that strength, he saw the fragility of his own convictions, the inadequacy of his long-held plans for revenge. That night he watched her from the edge of the porch as she knelt by the fire, finishing the repairs she had begun. The flickering light danced across her face, highlighting the curve of her lips, the concentration in her eyes, the subtle determination that infused every movement. He felt a strange, unsettling warmth rising in his chest, one he could not define, could not name, and yet could not ignore. The days blurred together, a sequence of labor, quiet observations, and subtle confrontations that revealed more about him than he wished. He had come to the ranch expecting to assert dominance, to manipulate, to control. Instead, he found himself learning to navigate the unexpected, the steady gaze that met his own without fear, the quiet strength that refused to bend, the small acts of kindness she extended to those around her. Each observation chipped away at the foundation of his anger, his resentment, and left in its place a raw, unacknowledged longing. It was during a late afternoon ride across the western pasture that the final, undeniable stirrings of awareness emerged. She rode alongside him, a natural rhythm in the movement of her horse that mirrored the calm authority she carried in life. The wind lifted her hair, and the sunlight kissed the lines of her face, revealing strength, beauty, and an indomitable will that left him breathless. He realized, with a shock that was both thrilling and terrifying, that he was no longer the orchestrator of this union, no longer the one in control. She had, without intent or premeditation, ensnared him entirely. That evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and the sky burned with shades of amber and violet, he found her at the edge of the barn once more, gathering tools for the day's end. She looked at him, eyes steady, and for the first time he felt the vulnerability of a man stripped bare, a man confronted with the truth of his own heart. He wanted to speak, to declare the tumult within him, yet pride and fear anchored his tongue. Instead, he watched, silent and unready, as she moved with quiet dignity, carrying herself with a grace that command or coercion. And in that moment, as the wind tugged at her hair and the golden light haloed her form, he understood something undeniable. The battle he had thought to wage against her was not with her at all. It was with himself, with the stirrings of a heart that refused to remain untouched. She paused in her work, sensing perhaps the tension in the air, and looked toward him with a faint, knowing smile, though it did not reach her eyes. It was enough to unsettle him entirely, to make him aware of the precariousness of the ground beneath him. He realized with sudden clarity that he could no longer maintain the rigid control he had intended, that the feelings he had sought to suppress were no longer suppressible. He stepped closer, boots crunching softly against the dry ground, and she did not flinch. The air between them thickened, charged with the unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. The plans of revenge, the carefully laid schemes, the calculated cruelty, all were now rendered meaningless in the face of the fragile, dangerous stirrings of attachment, of desire, of recognition. The night settled over the ranch, and they remained near the barn, a silence stretching between them that spoke louder than words. He could see the flicker of firelight across her profile, the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the determined set of her shoulders. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he could not bear to let her leave, not yet, not ever. And as she rose, folding the tools with deliberate care, her eyes meeting his with that same steady resolve, he realized the truth he had long refused to face. He was no longer the orchestrator of her fate. She had become the center of his own, and the realization left him raw, exposed, and achingly aware of the depth of what he stood to lose. The horizon beyond the ranch was painted in the last hues of twilight, and the wind carried with it the scent of dust, sweat, and the lingering warmth of the sun. Somewhere in that vast openness lay a challenge he had not anticipated, a woman who would not yield, a heart he could not command, and a future that demanded reckoning. And in that moment, as the shadows deepened and the first stars blinked into existence, he understood the precariousness of the path ahead, and the dangerous allure of the woman who had unknowingly ensnared him. The wind carried the scent of late summer across the ranch, warm and dry, brushing against the wooden porch in lazy golden currents. He stood at the edge of the veranda, boots planted firmly, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the horizon as though by sheer will he could command it to halt the passage of time. Every fiber of him was taut, every thought circling the one truth he had tried to deny. She was leaving. After days of subtle understanding, of quiet glances and unspoken admissions, the promise of her departure pressed against his chest like a weight too heavy to bear. She emerged from the house, her skirts rustling softly as she descended the steps. She held herself with that familiar grace, head high, shoulders squared, yet the tension in her hands betrayed the uncertainty she sought to mask. He had watched her enough now to recognize the small tells, the unguarded gestures that revealed more than words ever could. The basket of provisions she carried was light, yet her movements were precise, economical, deliberate, a woman prepared to leave behind more than a home. She had prepared to leave behind him. "Wait," he said, voice low, roughened by months of restraint, months of silent recognition of feelings he had long refused. The word carried command, but it was underscored by desperation, by an edge of vulnerability that he had never allowed himself to display. She froze, the basket resting at her side, eyes flicking toward him with guarded curiosity. I cannot," he continued, stepping closer, boots crunching against the dry boards. "Not like this, not without," his words faltered, as if speaking them aloud might shatter some fragile understanding he had only just begun to claim. She studied him, the sunlight catching her eyes and casting them in molten shades of amber and brown. Her expression was calm, yet it carried the weight of unspoken questions, a mirror to the storm that churned in his chest. "Without what?" she asked softly, the tilt of her head cautious, measured, as if testing the truth behind his words. He swallowed hard, and in that simple motion lay the sum of months of silent struggle. Without knowing if you'll stay," he admitted, each word deliberate, heavy, raw. "I cannot let you leave and pretend this, whatever this is, has no meaning." Her breath caught almost imperceptibly, and she took a careful step back, though she did not set down the basket. Her pride, ever present, demanded distance. Her heart, far more tender, quivered beneath it. "You mean you care," she said, voice soft, almost a whisper against the wind. "After everything, after the plans, the schemes." He shook his head, bitterness and admiration warring within him. "I cared the moment I realized you were not what I had intended you to be. You are stronger, more impossible than I ever imagined, and yet I cannot deny it any longer." He took another step, closing the space between them, though not recklessly, aware that one wrong move could drive her away forever. For a moment the world held its breath. Dust swirled in lazy columns around their feet, the distant lowing of cattle a gentle murmur beneath the tension. He saw the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, the conflict between pride and desire, independence and surrender. The same woman who had met every attempt to dominate her with calm defiance now stood on the precipice of yielding, and he recognized the gravity of the moment. One misstep, and it would vanish. She lowered the basket, setting it gently on the wooden boards, and for the first time he saw her vulnerability fully, unguarded. The movement was subtle, yet it carried more meaning than words could capture. She had prepared to leave, yes, but now she was choosing to face the storm of emotion alongside him, rather than flee it. He reached for her hand, hesitant, almost reverent. The brush of her skin against his ignited a thrill that raced through him, raw and urgent. Her eyes widened slightly at the touch, but she did not pull away. Instead, she let the contact linger, a fragile bridge spanning months of tension, of battles waged in silence, of understanding forged in glances and shared labor. "I cannot live without you," he said finally, the words raw, unpolished, yet imbued with every ounce of truth he had carried but never spoken. "I cannot watch you go, not knowing if you will return, not knowing if," his voice faltered, but the message was clear. His pride, his anger, the carefully orchestrated plans of revenge, all dissolved into the heat of confession. Her breath hitched, subtle but undeniable, and in that moment he saw the walls she had erected, the armor of independence, begin to crumble. She stepped closer, closing the space, her own hands trembling imperceptibly as they reached for him. The tension that had defined them, that had dictated every glance and gesture, gave way to something far more dangerous, far more real, the recognition of shared vulnerability, of mutual longing that had been present since the first days they had endured each other's presence. Their hands met fully, fingers entwining as if by instinct, as if the world had demanded connection before logic or reason could interfere. He felt the tremor in her grip, the warmth of her skin against his own, and the ache in his chest deepened, sharp and undeniable. He was no longer a man of control, of cold calculation. He was a man undone, stripped bare by the simple, elemental truth of affection returned. Then she did the unexpected. She stepped forward, closing the remaining distance, and wrapped her arms around him in a hug that was fierce in its gentleness. It was an embrace that carried months of unspoken truths, of shared labor, of glances stolen in the heat of the day and the quiet of evening. He froze initially, caught off guard by the sudden intimacy, but as her warmth pressed against him, as the subtle rhythm of her breathing met his own, something within him broke free. He tightened his hold, a rush of emotion sweeping through him in an overwhelming tide. Relief, desire, gratitude, and the fragile joy of recognition all collided in that single, fleeting moment. She had not fled, she had not submitted. She had chosen, in that quiet, tender way that spoke louder than words, to meet him on equal footing, to acknowledge that the bond between them was not one of control, but of understanding, of mutual respect, of love. Pulling back slightly, just enough to see her face, he traced the line of her cheek with his thumb, memorizing the curve, the warmth, the life in her eyes. "I never wanted this to be about revenge," he admitted, voice low, charged with vulnerability. I wanted to control everything, to punish, to make you mine in ways I cannot justify, but you've undone me." Her eyes glistened in the fading light, yet there was no fear, no hesitation. Instead, there was understanding, recognition of the truth they had both felt but neither had spoken aloud. "And you've undone me," she whispered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I thought I could leave, that I could escape it all, but I cannot leave what has grown here, not between us." The weight of unspoken months lifted slightly in that exchange, replaced by a heady mixture of anticipation and relief. They stood in the golden twilight, the ranch stretching endlessly around them, the air heavy with the scent of dry grass, dust, and lingering warmth from the sun. For the first time, the tension that had defined their days, the unyielding wills, the subtle conflicts, the quiet power struggles, transformed into something wholly different, shared desire, tempered by respect, illuminated by recognition of their own hearts. The following days were a blur of small, intimate reconciliations. She no longer fled from his presence, nor did he attempt to assert dominance over her. They shared meals, worked side by side tending the ranch, and in quiet moments their hands brushed, their eyes met, and laughter began to creep into spaces that had long been filled with silence or tension. The ease of companionship, the thrill of mutual recognition, was intoxicating, and yet beneath it lay the fragile understanding that the peace they now shared was hard-won, delicate, and worth protecting. Even the ranch itself seemed to respond to the shift. The cattle moved with less agitation, the fields felt warmer beneath the sun, and the old barn, which had been a stage for silent battles, now held echoes of laughter and whispered conversation. Every corner of the land bore witness to their transformation, from adversaries bound by circumstance to partners bound by choice, each learning to navigate the delicate terrain of hearts laid bare. One evening after the chores were done, he found her standing at the edge of the pasture, horse tethered nearby, watching the sky bleed into shades of crimson and violet. The air was cool now, carrying the scent of distant rain and the musk of the earth beneath. He approached slowly, boots barely making a sound, and she did not turn, though her posture shifted slightly, welcoming him without need for words. "You never told me," she said softly, voice carrying a note of wonder, "how easily you could feel." He smiled, a faint, wry smile that did not hide the tremor in his chest. "I didn't know it was possible," he admitted. "Not with anyone, not until you came. You made me see what I was missing." Her gaze lifted then, meeting his fully, and in that instant there was no hesitation, no caution. She closed the distance, wrapping her arms around him once more. The hug was stronger now, intentional, a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. And in that embrace, he understood fully what months of struggle had revealed, that love was not about possession, nor about vengeance, nor about control. It was about recognition, about choosing one another when the world demanded otherwise, about letting walls fall and letting the heart lead. The first stars began to blink into existence overhead, silver points in a deepening navy sky, and the wind whispered across the open fields. He rested his chin atop her head, inhaling the warmth of her hair, and felt a contentment he had never known, a certainty he had never dared to imagine. "Stay with me," he murmured into the curve of her neck, voice trembling with emotion he could no longer hide. "Stay for everything." She lifted her head slightly, eyes shining with unshed tears and laughter, lips curving into a soft, triumphant smile. "I will," she replied, "for everything." And for the first time in months, perhaps for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to truly believe it. The past, the schemes, the plans, the grudges, had all fallen away, leaving only the raw, unyielding truth of their connection. They lingered there, arms entwined, hearts beating in a quiet symphony beneath the expanse of sky, aware of the distance they had traversed and the uncertainty that still lay ahead. Yet for the first time, it was not fear that defined the horizon, but hope, fragile and shining, like the first light of dawn. When at last they pulled apart, it was with reluctance, with the understanding that life would continue with challenges and demands, yet fortified by the certainty of each other's presence. He held her hands, memorizing the warmth, the strength, the life in her fingers, and she mirrored him, reflecting back the depth of feeling he had fought to conceal. They walked toward the house together, shoulders brushing, laughter soft and easy, voices blending with the whispers of wind and the distant lowing of cattle. The ranch, once a place of tension, became a sanctuary of shared purpose, a testament to the power of recognition, of vulnerability, of choice. And as the last light of the sun bled into the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, he understood fully what months of struggle had shown him, that some battles are not meant to be won by force, but by surrender, by yielding to the heart, by acknowledging truth, by embracing what cannot be. She stopped at the doorway, turning toward him one final time, eyes bright in the fading light. "Whatever comes," she said, voice steady, yet soft, "we face it together." He smiled, pressing a brief, reverent kiss to her forehead, a promise and a claim, not of ownership, but of partnership. "Together," he echoed. And as the stars brightened in the vast canvas above, the ranch stretched endlessly around them, silent witness to the transformation wrought by persistence, courage, and love. The past, with its grudges and plans, lay behind, and before them lay a future wide, open, and golden, illuminated by the knowledge that they had found in one another not conquest, nor revenge, nor duty, but the rare, wild, unassailable truth of belonging.